Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are covering some of the material, the rest of the material from lesson number 8 about the skeletal system. To help us get into this material, we did a few prediction questions here in groups. So we're going to start by talking about what might happen in your body if our two main types of bone cells were to become too active. Now, for my friends here in the chat, my question for you, yesterday we talked about osteoclasts and we talked about osteoblasts. We also talked about one other kind of bone cell. What was the other kind of bone cell that we talked about yesterday? What's that third kind called? Yeah, that third kind, they're called the osteocytes. The osteocytes. When we were talking about osteocytes, what did we say about them? What's our description of an osteocyte? Yeah, osteocytes, I told you guys to think about them kind of like they're the retired bone cells. Retired bone cells. So the reason I didn't put them on our list here is my osteocytes are retired. Yeah, or more technically, Christina's totally right. They're mature. That would be the more technical way to describe them. When we talk about osteocytes, these are the type of bone cells that they can't build any more bone tissue. They don't have the enzymes to break down bone tissue. All they do is they take care of their little home. They just stay at home and take care of it. Remind me, when we talk about the home that my osteocytes live in, what's the name of the home that osteocytes live inside of? Yeah, so my osteocytes live inside of a lacuna. Lacuna equals their home. So osteocytes, they just stay at home. They stay in their lacuna. They're going to make sure their lacuna is in good shape, that the bone tissue is not like dying, but they really can't do a whole lot. So as a heads up, the reason I didn't include them on our list here, osteocytes like couldn't be too active because there's not really anything that they do. So osteocytes, those are my retired bone cells. Remember, we kind of have a circle of life thing going on here. Osteoblasts turn into osteocytes. So when you're young, up and coming, you're an osteoblast. Then you turn into an osteocyte when there's not space for you to do any more work, when it's time for you to retire. Hey, let's start with these ones since we're kind of on this vein here. When I talk about osteoblasts, what is the job of an osteoblast? Its normal job. What's the normal job of osteoblasts? Yeah, osteoblasts are my bone builders. Osteoblast equals bone builder. Anytime you see blast, it always means builder. So here's a reminder from lab that when we were talking about our connective tissues, we said that they had cells called fibroblasts. Fibroblasts. Based on its name and on what you remember, what do fibroblasts do? What's their job? I'll type it for us so we can see that word. Fibroblasts. Yeah, Tierney's 100% right. The fibro part in its name means fibers. So fibro equals fibers. And the blast part of its name equals a builder. So when we looked at tissues like areolar, loose connective tissue, the dots that were cells, those were my fibroblasts. Or when we looked at dense, regular connective tissue, you saw those squeezed flat cells, those were fibroblasts, fiber builders. So again, anytime we see blast, we are always thinking builder. Hey, what are we always thinking when we see clast? What does a clast do, or an osteoclast in particular? What's the normal job of an osteoclast? Yeah, these are my bone breakers. Bone breakers. This end part clast always means we're breaking stuff down. This end part blast means we're building something. Yeah, so Tierney and Christina, you guys are going to keep me honest, right? We use this easy word, bone breaker. Technically, when we're talking about what osteoclasts do, 100% correct. The technical term for what they do is bone resorption. Resorption. So taking the calcium that's inside your bone and putting it back into the bloodstream, that's the job of an osteoclast. So here, let's make a note about that. Bone resorption is when we take the calcium in a bone and return it, cannot spell this morning, to the bloodstream. That's the job, or that's the goal of bone resorption. Break down our bone, get that calcium back into the bloodstream. So osteoclasts are my bone breakers. They're my cells that specifically do bone resorption, the process of breaking down bone tissue. Osteoblasts are my bone builders. When I build bone, what ends up happening is I take calcium that's in the bloodstream and put it into bone tissue. So when I build bone, I take calcium out of the bloodstream and put it into bone tissue. There we go. When we're talking about our hormones that we're going to look at on the next slide, think about the effects that they end up having on cells. It's all about calcium levels. So we have a normal level of calcium in the bloodstream. That's something our body maintains at homeostasis. If I get too high or if I get too low, I don't like it. Just like with your body temperature, if you get too hot or you get too cold, I don't like it. So when we talk about hormones that are changing the levels of calcium in the bloodstream, it's because I've got a normal set point, a normal amount that I need. If I have too much or too little, that's problematic for me. That's not going to be great. We're not to hormones yet though, right? Right now we're talking about our cells. So let's think about what would happen if my bone breakers were too active. What were some of the things that we said in our group work? What might happen in your body if your osteoclasts are too active? What's going to happen? Okay, yep, so Jesse's mentioning bones become weak. Absolutely. They might become brittle. Bones become brittle. Group 2, I know you had a particular word that we mentioned about our bones. There was an idea that you guys mentioned. What was the word that we used to describe how thick our bones are, or how much bone mass we have? And remember, yeah, the bone density, exactly. If my osteoclasts are too active, my bone density goes down. So when we're talking about the kinds of things that would happen in your body if my osteoclasts are too active, it really at its core starts with this. My bone density is going to go down. Bone density, again, that's the amount of bone tissue that you have. Let's do some review in my corner up here. When we talk about bone connective tissue, we talked about how bone connective tissue, because it's a connective tissue, has cells and extracellular matrix. Remind me again, what's the general name for bone cells? What's the normal name for bone cells? My retired bone cells, shall we say. What's the name of those guys? Yeah, those guys are called the osteocytes. Osteocytes. The part of bone connective tissue is those osteocytes. The other part is that stuff we talked about called extracellular matrix. Remind me again, extracellular. What does extracellular mean? extracellular. Exactly, outside the cell. Outside of cells in bone connective tissue, two things. First thing, calcium, technically calcium phosphate. I'll put that in parentheses for you. First thing outside my bone cells, calcium. The place in your body that you store the most calcium is in your bone tissue. The second thing that's outside those cells is collagen. Collagen on the outside. We talked about yesterday how collagen makes your bones resistant to breaking. So if you think about your arm getting twisted or something like that, collagen is there to prevent those bones from breaking. Calcium is there to make the bones really hard. So to keep them upright, to keep them stable, that's the job of calcium. Okay, let's see if we know this yet. For my friends who started working on that disorders activity, we had a disorder that was a problem with collagen. You make really bad collagen. Does anyone remember which one's the collagen problem? I've got to vote for osteoporosis. I've got to vote for rickets. I actually don't have, I was gonna say I don't have a vote yet for the right one. It is actually the third, the last one. So Osteogenesis Imperfecta, let me type its name out here, Osteogenesis Imperfecta. This is a disorder where a person has a bad genetic sequence for building the protein collagen. Because their DNA codes for a bad form of collagen that's not very strong, their bones are really, really weak. They're really, really brittle. In addition to reading about osteogenesis imperfecta, there is a video included for you of a family who has a daughter with osteogenesis imperfecta. It's called Our Baby Made of Glass. So it's like a human interest story. It is really, it's sad. But they talked about how they addressed this disorder in her life. One of the things, the way they found out she had this disorder was actually in utero. They did her first, or not her first, it was a couple ultrasounds in when they were doing the growth scan. They could already see bone fractures in her bones when she was in utero. That tells you how brittle her bones were. So osteogenesis imperfecta, the normal or the easy way to describe this is called brittle bone disease. That's what happens when your collagen is wrong. Your bones break very easily all the time. I think they talk about like the wind can blow and break her bones, which is a little bit of an exaggeration, right? But very simple things break this poor girl's bones. So Our Baby Made of Glass, it's a great heart-wrenching video, but it's a good way to learn a little bit about osteogenesis imperfecta. So one of the extracellular matrix components, one of the things that's outside of my bone cells is collagen. The other thing that's outside of my bone cells is calcium. Calcium is, like we said, it's kind of like what makes the cement of a street, for example. So the collagen was like that rebar metal in it, and then the calcium is all the stuff we pour on top of it. When we talk about the calcium in the bone, there is a disorder that we're learning about where your body doesn't put enough calcium in the bone. I'm building my bone tissue. I don't put enough calcium in it when I build it. Which disorder is that one, where I build my bones without enough calcium? Well, it's a good thing we're talking about this. So when we talk about building my bones without enough calcium, bone building is something that happens when you're younger, in younger life. The disorder that's a problem with I don't build my bones with enough calcium in them is rickets. Now, For my friends who chimed in osteoporosis, osteoporosis is also a problem with calcium. What is going on when someone has osteoporosis? What's happening to their bone? How might we describe what happens in osteoporosis? Any thoughts? Yeah, so Christina mentions bone density goes down. Absolutely. Bone density is decreasing. And what specifically is decreasing is the amount of calcium. So Jacqueline's totally right too. She said that the osteoclasts are more active than the osteoblasts, 100%. So my bone breakers are going through and they are stealing all of the calcium that's in your bone tissue and releasing that back into the bloodstream. Remember, there's a certain amount of calcium that I want to have. I need to have a certain amount of calcium. So if I have that certain amount of calcium, I'm good. If my calcium level gets low, I'm going to tell my osteoclasts to break down my bone tissue to give it to me. The problem in osteoporosis is not necessarily that my blood calcium is low, as much as just my osteoclasts get down to business and they break down all the bone tissue. So my osteoclasts are too active in osteoporosis. That makes those bones weak, or like its name talks about, osteoporosis. I literally have pores, or I have open spaces inside my bone tissue where there used to be calcium and there is not calcium anymore. So osteoporosis and rickets, both of these are an issue with the amount of calcium that's in my bone tissue. With osteoporosis, I stole too much calcium from my bones. I am taking the calcium away. With rickets, I don't put enough calcium in. So what you see in an individual who has rickets is they talk about bones that are kind of bowing, or they're bending in at the edges, or the bones are just really soft. They've got plenty of collagen, not enough of that calcium that makes them hard or makes them really stable. So rickets is a calcium problem. You're building bone and you don't put enough calcium into the bone. Osteoporosis is a calcium problem. I'm stealing the calcium that I would find in that bone tissue. Yeah, so Jesse mentioned if your calcium gets too low, you end up in the hospital. Yes, 100% correct. It's not only a problem with my bone tissue. Rickets, usually it's not the bones are weak that brings someone to the hospital. It can actually be more like an issue like with your heart, for example. Part of why we keep calcium so stable in the body is because we need it for the functioning of all kinds of our organs. So rickets can by itself be not severe enough that you have other problems, but if you have really severe rickets, if you have really low calcium in your bloodstream, you would also see a lot of other issues as well, not just bone problems, but heart problems, teeth problems, a lot of things that we use calcium for sure. Okay, so we mentioned this. Let's just make sure we make the correlation. When we talk about osteoclasts being too active, that is what happens in osteoporosis. Osteoporosis, I break down my bone tissue too much, my bone breakers are too active, that ends up giving me low bone density, which because I don't have a dense enough bone, my bones are brittle and they're falling apart. So if osteoclasts are too active, you see something like osteoporosis. What if, hypothetically speaking, my osteoblasts were too active? What effect might that have on my bones? What were some of the things that we talked about with the osteoblasts being too active? Yeah, so my osteoblasts are bone builders. If they get more active, we're going to grow those bones. We're going to make the bones more dense. Yeah, absolutely. There is, here, let me do a Google search really fast. Let me see if this is actually, Okay, so really cool thing. Let me pull it up here. I'm gonna send you a link. Woo! I can't vouch for this particular article, but there is a thing called, I'll type that first in the chat, Stone Man Syndrome. Stone Man Syndrome. Here's a link for you to look at later, probably not right now, it's got a video attached to it. In Stone Man Syndrome, you actually take some of your muscles and connective tissues and turn them into bone tissue. So you basically become a stone man, you become a statue because you're building too much bone tissue. So osteoblasts, if they get too active, at first my bone density goes up, bone density up. If it gets really extreme, I can build too much bone. Absolutely. Great correlation that Jesse made in the chat too. If we're talking about osteoblasts being really active, my bone builders being really active, remember that we said that we take calcium out of the bloodstream when these are active. So if an osteoblast were to get too active, that would lower blood calcium. Lower blood calcium. Make it too low, potentially. So if this happens for too long, my blood calcium might get really, really low. If my osteoblasts are stealing it all and putting it all into bone tissue. What would happen to my calcium level if my osteoclasts are too active? What's going to happen to blood calcium if osteoclasts are too active? We're all reading about Stone Man Syndrome. That's my fault. It's on me. Yeah, if my osteoclast gets too active, too high blood calcium. Because what happens when osteoclasts do their job is they spit calcium out into the bloodstream. If I just keep breaking down and breaking down and breaking down bone tissue, my blood calcium is going to go up, potentially dangerously too high. So if these are way too active, I might end up with too high of blood calcium, or I might end up with too low of blood calcium. Jesse has a question. What's that question?
So what would happen if your blood calcium is too high? Like what kind of symptoms would you have and what effects would it have on the body?
A great question that I don't 100% know the answer to.
Okay.
I will have to look into that. I would imagine, since it's something that's involved in things like regulating muscle contraction, I feel like maybe it could be an issue with like muscle contraction, neuron signaling type stuff. Yeah, I apologize. I don't know the answer to that one yet.
No, that's okay. I had a friend who had surgery on her thyroid. She had cancer, and they put her parathyroid to sleep, so to speak, for the surgery, and then it didn't become active right away after, so her body wasn't absorbing any calcium, so she actually ended up in the hospital because she her body was going numb and she couldn't feel things and stuff. She couldn't move very well and stuff. So that's why I was like, so if there's that's when there's not enough calcium. So if there's too much calcium, probably the same.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. We will talk about in lesson number 10 about the way that neurons work, and the way that they signal each other is by bringing calcium inside of them. So if you don't have enough calcium outside your cells, like your friend didn't have enough calcium in her body, I've got nothing to bring inside my cell to tell it to talk to its neighbor. So I wonder if some of the reason that she was losing sensation is because she didn't have any calcium to rush into her cell to spit out those neurotransmitters.
Right.
That's really interesting.
It was so crazy. And she looks like she has a scar across her neck, like it literally looks like she slit her throat.
Yes, yeah. That's where the thyroid gland is.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that one, but
Okay, thank you.
will remind me of it in lesson number 10 when we're talking about neuron signaling, because we can make that correlation. I've got some good pictures that'll help us understand that in lesson number 10. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Let me see. Keenan had a question. If our bones build too much bone, what would happen to the spongy bone? What might, when we're building bone tissue, it's easier for us to build spongy bone than it is for us to build compact bone. So if my osteoblasts are too active, initially, I'm actually probably mostly going to build extra spongy bone. It takes longer for me to build compact bone. So I may end up with increased bone density. Probably a good amount of that increased density would actually be in the spongy bone, because that's a lot easier for me to build than if I have compact bone. So in terms of what would happen to it, I think that's where a lot of our bone density would increase, because we'd be building a lot of new spongy bone. Yeah, so Jacqueline's question that multiple of us are agreeing on is we want to know about parathyroid hormone. So, okay, let's check it out. We'll go to our next slide here. Okay, before we talk about too much of any of these things, let's start by talking about what these things do. So, parathyroid hormone. Remind me in the chat, what happens when we release parathyroid hormone? What's going on in the body when I spit out parathyroid hormone? Normal function. Normal function. What does parathyroid hormone do? Who does it talk to? Okay, yep, normal function of parathyroid hormone is to increase osteoclast activity. Okay, that's my normal function of parathyroid hormone. What is the normal function of osteoclasts? What do osteoclasts do? What's the job of osteoclasts? Okay, osteoclasts break down bone. When osteoclasts break down bone, what happens to calcium? Yeah, they're doing resorption. Absolutely. Let's add that word. When I do resorption, what happens to my blood calcium level? If I do bone resorption and I break down bone tissue, what's happening to my blood calcium level? Yep, blood calcium goes up. Okay, there are two places there's calcium in the body. Place one that there's calcium in the body is inside your bone tissue, where I store it. Place two where there's calcium in the body is inside the bloodstream. When we talk about parathyroid hormone, the goal of parathyroid hormone is to increase, here we should have put this note down here too. So we said what it does, who it talks to, parathyroid hormone. But the other thing that parathyroid hormone does is it increases blood calcium level. The overall big picture, why do I need parathyroid hormone? Is because this is a hormone that increases the level of calcium in the bloodstream. Remember, I've got calcium in the blood, I've got calcium in the bone. Primarily, when you think about calcium in your bone, think about this as storage. This is storage of calcium. It can go up, it can go down based on what I need. What I need is determined based on the level of calcium in my bloodstream. So there's that level, and remember, I'm never going to make you remember this, but 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters. This is normal. I must have this much in my bloodstream for me to be able to function correctly. If this number gets low, let's say we're down now at 5 milligrams per 100 milliliters. If I get to here, if this is what my blood calcium is now, my body says, OMG, not enough. I don't have what I need. So my body spits out parathyroid hormone because parathyroid hormone talks to osteoclasts. And it says, hey, osteoclasts, you have the ability to break down bone tissue. And bone tissue is where I have calcium stored. So if you break down that bone tissue, that calcium that was stored in the bone is free to go into the bloodstream. I need it in the bloodstream. Therefore, you're going to do that job for me to bring that calcium level back up to normal. I need some feedback. What questions do we have right now? Nicole's got a thumbs up. Yeah, Jacqueline, you're on the fence still. Jesse says it makes a little more sense. This stuff that we have right here, we need to make sure we understand this. So let me review it one more time. I want you guys to help me out. Think of questions that you have about this. Okay, first thing for you to know about parathyroid hormone. The goal of this hormone is to make your blood calcium go higher. Biggest picture, the homeostasis stuff we're talking about here in lesson number 8, it's all about blood calcium level. That's what we care about. Right now we're focusing on blood calcium level. So parathyroid hormone, its job is to help your blood calcium level go up to get back to normal. So when my blood calcium is too low, I'm going to spit out parathyroid hormone because parathyroid hormone is going to help me raise my blood calcium level. That's the first thing that we just need to memorize. Parathyroid hormone makes blood calcium go up. Yeah, so here's the way it does that, Jacqueline, to answer your question. Parathyroid hormone activates osteoclasts. It goes to my bone breakers and it tells them, hey guys, kick into action. I need you to do your job. Your job is to break down bone tissue. Bone tissue is where I store my calcium. So the second thing that parathyroid hormone does is it tells my osteoclasts to get active. So we need to know, number one, ultimately, parathyroid hormone increases the amount of calcium in the blood. Number two, how it does that is by telling my osteoclasts, get active. I need you to be activated so that you can do your job. Because number three, the job of osteoclasts is to break down bone tissue. When I break down bone tissue, that's going to raise my level of calcium. That's going to take me from 5 milligrams per 100 mils to 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 mils because I'm stealing that stored calcium and putting it back in the bloodstream. What thoughts, questions, what are we thinking now? Did that help at all? Okay, Christina says she feels a little bit better about it now. Okay, so keep those things in mind. Number one, the goal of parathyroid hormone, elevating blood calcium, making blood calcium go up. Number two, the way it does it, telling those osteoclasts to kick into gear. That's going to make calcium go up because osteoclasts break down bone. When I break down bone, that frees up the calcium that's in the bone tissue to go into the bloodstream. Again, we kind of got, we'll add a circle of life thing here. So we've got calcium in bone, and we've got calcium in blood. 2 places in the body that we have calcium. If I have too much calcium in the bloodstream, I will put it into my bone tissue if I've got too much. If I have too little in the bloodstream, I'm going to steal it from my bone to put it back in the blood. So we got a circle of life going on over here. And let's make a correlation. The cell that helps me to take my calcium that's in the blood and put it into bone tissue, who does this half of the loop? Who takes blood calcium and turns it into bone calcium? What kind of cell would help me do that? Yeah, Nicole's right. The cell that allows me to take calcium that's in the bloodstream and store it in my bone are cells called osteoblasts. Remember my bone builders? They take blood calcium, hide it away in bone tissue. But say I need that bone tissue calcium to go back into my bloodstream. Who allows me to put calcium back into the bloodstream? Who takes it out of bone and puts it back in blood? What type of cell is gonna do that? That's where those osteoclasts come into play. So osteoclasts steal that bone calcium, put it back in the bloodstream. Osteoblasts take that blood calcium and put it back into bone builders. So when we talk about parathyroid hormone is what I'm going to release when I don't have enough calcium. So if I've got low calcium, here we can draw a little gradient here. Here's a concentration gradient for us. My low concentration is in the blood, and my high concentration is in the bone. So low concentration to high concentration. I need my osteoclasts to break down my bone tissue to put it back into the blood. That arrow is not helpful, is it? Here, let's delete it. Lots and little. There's my concentration gradient. That's gonna use those osteoclasts. If I have a lot in bone and a little in the blood, osteoclasts get activated. If I have a lot in the blood, I can put that into my bone tissue. My osteoblasts can put that into bone tissue. So when you eat a diet high in calcium, we use our osteoblasts to build our bone tissue. Thumbs up, thumbs down. What are our thoughts about the bone or the calcium circle of life over here? This is always hard because I can't see your faces. I feel like I'm decent at reading faces. So in the classroom, I'd be able to tell if we understood. It's hard online. Okay, well, before we talk about too much parathyroid hormone, I want to talk about calcitonin really fast. When we talk about calcitonin, what does calcitonin do to my blood calcium level? What effect does calcitonin have on blood calcium? Yeah, so the normal function of calcitonin is to lower blood calcium. That's its normal function. Now, the way calcitonin does that is a little bit funky. Calcitonin still talks to osteoclast cells. So when we're talking about who listens for or who can hear the message calcitonin, it is still osteoclasts that hear the message calcitonin. But does anyone happen to remember from yesterday's class, when an osteoclast hears calcitonin as its message, what happens? What does that cause the osteoclast to do if it gets calcitonin? Yeah, so when the message calcitonin is sent, osteoclasts activity goes down. My osteoclasts aren't working as hard. When my osteoclasts don't work as hard, I don't break down as much bone tissue. So if my osteoclasts slow down, what ends up happening is less bone resorption. Less bone resorption. Okay, so first thing that happens, osteoclasts stop being activated. That's going to mean that the process of bone resorption slows down or completely stops. If bone resorption stops, I am not releasing calcium from the bone anymore. Let me type that. The goal of bone resorption is to release calcium into the bloodstream. If I stop bone resorption, I'm not releasing calcium anymore. So we stop resorbing bone, we stop breaking down bone, no more calcium going into the bloodstream. So I'm not putting new calcium in. Now, at the same time that my osteoclasts are slowing down, that they're stopping resorbing the bone, at the same time that's happening, my osteoblasts are over here just doing their normal job. They didn't get the memo, the calcitonin memo, that we're supposed to slow down. So they're just puttering along doing their normal job. Osteoclasts stop spitting out calcium for them to use to build bone. So they're just grabbing the calcium that's already in the bloodstream. So calcitonin only has an impact on osteoclasts, makes them slow down. Meanwhile, those osteoblasts just keep going. So osteoblasts do their normal job. Their normal job is to build bone tissue. If I keep building and building and building, that's going to take that blood calcium, where there's a lot of it, and put it into the bone tissue. That's going to cause my blood calcium to go down. It gets lower. How do we feel about calcitonin? How do we feel about calcitonin? Okay, so I was going to ask Jack, and I was like, I know for sure what I said last. So when my osteoclasts stop doing their job, what osteoclasts do is they break down bone to keep calcium in the bloodstream. If my osteoclasts aren't putting any new calcium into the bloodstream, but my osteoblasts just keep taking all of the calcium that's in the bloodstream, the calcium in the bloodstream where I had a lot of it ends up going straight into the bone tissue, and that bone tissue just starts storing it. So the blood calcium level goes down because I keep taking and taking and taking this calcium to put it into the bone, but I'm not at the same time breaking down any bone to put back into the bloodstream. So if I only go this direction, if we're only doing this side of the loop, the amount of calcium in the bloodstream goes down because it's all going into bone tissue. When we're doing normal life in your cells, the rate that I build my bone tissue is equal to the rate that I break it down. Normally, these both kind of stay steady. If I stop breaking down bone tissue, and I keep building new bone tissue, that's going to cause the amount of calcium in the blood to go down because there's nothing to go back into it. Nothing's going to pull it back down. So the osteoblasts keep building even though the osteoclasts have stopped breaking down. That's how I end up with calcium levels being lower in the bloodstream. Correct. Yep. So Nicole's question is, so none of these hormones are talking to the osteoblasts. That's correct. None of these hormones. Does anyone happen to remember from the guided lesson? We did mention a hormone that does talk to osteoblasts. Does anyone happen to know? Yeah. So in our circle of life, when we're talking about these hormones, no impact on osteoblasts. Who does talk to osteoblasts is estrogen. Estrogen talks, or I'll put in parentheses here, talks to osteoblasts. Estrogen makes my osteoblasts get more active. That's one of their jobs. And you can actually see the effect of estrogen when you start looking at what happens when a woman goes through menopause. Because when a woman goes through menopause, we stop releasing estrogen. And when there's not that estrogen released anymore, the osteoblast activity, the bone builder activity, goes down. And so then we're having the same issue where I'm not building bone anymore. This half of my loop is gone, but this half keeps going. The osteoclasts keep doing their normal job. That's why bone density goes down. So think about a big picture with our homeostasis. Really think about this loop here. I've got calcium in the blood. I've got calcium in my bone tissue. If I'm taking calcium out of the blood and putting it into bone, that's the job of osteoblasts. They're building my bone tissue. If I'm taking that calcium out of my bones to put it back in the bloodstream, that's the job of the osteoclasts. Ideally, we're doing things at the same rate. If we start messing stuff up, if we start changing things with parathyroid hormone, with calcitonin, with estrogen, if we start changing this balance, that's when we see our bone density change. I'll build more bone, I'll break down more bone. That's what happens with bone density. It all comes down to this circle of life, if you will. So the question is, can your thyroid cause you to have osteoporosis? So the question, the corollary question to that then is, when we talk about the thyroid gland, which of these hormones did the thyroid gland make? Do we remember from yesterday? Yeah, so my thyroid gland, we'll add a note about that. Thyroid gland makes calcitonin. The thyroid gland makes calcitonin. If the thyroid gland is doing its normal job and making calcitonin at a normal level, calcitonin technically increases bone density. So let's think about this. I said calcitonin increases bone density. Let me write that down. Increases bone density. How does it do this? It does this by slowing down osteoclasts. If I don't break down bone, but I keep building it, my bone density goes up. So as long as the thyroid gland is making calcitonin, I am going to keep building my bone tissue like I should be. Yeah, because I'm putting calcium into the bone. Absolutely. When calcitonin says this message, we stop stealing that calcium and we just keep adding that calcium. So the thyroid gland, when it's doing its normal job, when it's spitting out the normal amount of calcitonin, or any extra calcitonin, that's going to increase my bone density. I'm going to make more bone because I'm slowing down my bone breakers. I think what's more likely to cause osteoporosis is an issue with the parathyroid hormone. And this kind of goes to if we have too much parathyroid hormone. Remember, parathyroid hormone makes my bone breakers work harder. If my bone breakers are working harder, we are losing calcium from the blood, or from the bone, excuse me. So parathyroid hormone, I'm going to abbreviate it, PTH, decreases bone density. Parathyroid hormone decreases bone density because I'm stealing all of the calcium that's in my bone to put it into the bloodstream. So if I had too much parathyroid hormone, my bone density would go down, like way down. It could give me osteoporosis down. If I had too much calcitonin, we'd be back on that spectrum where we end up just building extra bone tissue. It's a little bit more dense, if you will. You did ask a good question, though. So I asked you guys about having too much of these things. We could and maybe should talk about if we have too little of these things. So let's put a note over here, too little calcitonin. If I have too little calcitonin, if I don't send this message anymore, I'm never slowing down my osteoclasts. So if I don't ever slow them down, hypothetically, it could be possible that I would end up breaking down too much bone tissue. If they're always going at normal pace and maybe my osteoblasts start to slow down a little bit, that could make this process go faster. So if I have too little calcitonin, I may end up with decreasing my bone density. It could be the opposite. If I never slow those osteoclasts down, that could decrease my bone density. Or let me put a note down here, too little parathyroid hormone. If I have too little calcitonin, we said that we could develop low bone density because I never slow down those breakers. Those breakers just keep going. That could lead to low bone density. If I don't have enough parathyroid hormone, I am then never encouraging my osteoclasts to do bone resorption. I might slow down the process of bone remodeling. Bone remodeling, which is another word for resorption, could slow down. Okay, we have talked about a lot of big picture stuff. I need you to tell me what questions we still have. Or shoot me an emoji. It doesn't have to be a thumbs up. How are we feeling? Okay. I'm glad that Jessie says she's feeling a little better. Good. Yeah. Gloria's still a little on the fence. Keenan's mind is blown. Yep. So the question is, parathyroid hormone steals blood calcium from bone. Yes. So when we talk about what thyroid hormone does, its goal is to get calcium in the bloodstream. The way that we get calcium in the bloodstream is by stealing it from the bone. Yes. Sigh of relief. Good. Okay. And here's what I'll say, because we're in that home stretch to be studying for the exam, right? Here's what I would say. The way that we've talked about these hormones today, the way that we've made predictions about too much and too little, that's the kind of stuff that we want and really need to be able to do for the exam. If you notice the learning objective related to blood calcium, it asks you to explain this process. Explaining this process is being able to put it in your own words to kind of outline, okay, here's the normal job of something. And when it does its normal job, here's what happens. And so this series that we went through, we kind of outlined all of these pieces that go into the role of parathyroid hormone in blood calcium homeostasis. This is the kind of thing when you're thinking about studying, outline the facts for yourself. Think about the steps and the information that we talked about that all goes together into making something happen. So when you see those explains or those describe learning objectives, this is what it looks like, how we would explain that information. Because that's going to help us know, if I ask you, I've got too much, what's going to happen? Or if I ask you, I've got too little, we would be able to answer that if we can explain, if we can go kind of step by step. So Nicole asked the question in the chat. Are you asking about parathyroid hormone, Nicole? I don't know which hormone you're asking about. Okay, so let me put this to the class. What happens if we have too much parathyroid hormone? What's going to happen in your body if we have too much parathyroid hormone? Ooh, again. Yeah, so if I have too much parathyroid hormone, yep, my bone density is going to go down because I'm stealing all of that calcium to go into the bloodstream. So two things happen. First thing, my bone density decreases. And Gloria is absolutely right. The second thing that we should probably add, actually, for both of these, is if I've got too much parathyroid hormone, my blood calcium would increase. Blood calcium increases. It would go up too high. If I have too much calcitonin, what's going to happen to the level of calcium in my bloodstream? What happens to calcium in the blood if I have too much calcitonin? That actually decreases. Here, so let me put a little box around for us. Ultimately, the answer to our actual question, or what happens when I have too much of these things, right here, highlighted in green. My bone density would increase if I have too much calcitonin. My blood calcium would decrease. And the opposite down here, I would decrease the bone density I have and increase my amount of blood in the blood if I have too much parathyroid hormone. I'm just realizing I never told you guys this. Here's a good way to remember what calcitonin does. Calcitonin makes calcium go in the bone tissue. Calcitonin, so underline here on the in, putting calcium into your bones. Calcitonin, put it into the bones. Parathyroid hormone, pull it out. So if you remember whether we're putting stuff into the bones or pulling it out of the bones, that's going to help a lot. Because then if you can also remember this little circle that we made here, if I put calcium into the bones, it must be coming out of the bloodstream. Or if I'm taking calcium out of the bones, it must be going into the bloodstream. So as long as we remember what's going on with one half of these things, whether the bones are going up or going down, we can also then predict what's happening with the blood, with the amount of calcium in the blood. Thumbs up. Thumbs down. Mind blown. Need more coffee? Yeah, Gloria's starting to see cross-eyed. I feel ya. So let me pull something up really fast to show you. Can you tell me from your notes packet, what page do you have this picture? What page did this one come from? Okay, Jesse's saying page 13. Page 13, okay. I bring us to this page to mention, we said when we were talking about the hormones, that the other hormone that has an effect on bone density is estrogen. So let me type that here at the top, estrogen. Estrogen has an effect on bone density as well. We know this because when we look at a person's bone density, we see a dramatic decrease right here when a woman goes through menopause. So when a woman goes through menopause, she stops making estrogen. The role of estrogen, as one of those videos that you're watching in the guided lesson tells you, estrogen increases osteoblast activity. Estrogen increases osteoblast activity, or it keeps the osteoblasts doing their normal job. Remind me, because it's been a while since I asked this, what's the job of osteoblasts? What do osteoblasts do? Yeah, those are my bone builders, right? So osteoblasts, those are, oops, lost my text here. Osteoblasts equal bone builder. Okay, so what happens in menopause then is the message that I used to tell my osteoblasts to keep building bone, that message goes away. Remember in our circle of life, when we were talking yesterday, osteoblast activity should be equal to osteoclast activity. This is normal. When I have estrogen, estrogen helps my osteoblasts to work just as hard as my osteoclasts. When I lose estrogen, my osteoblasts slow down. So now what ends up happening is my osteoblast activity is lower than, or it's less than, my osteoclast activity. Now my osteoclasts are working harder than my osteoblasts. And when that happens, I end up losing bone density. So the big idea of this graph is it helps us see the impact of estrogen on bone density. When I lose estrogen, I lose bone density. And I'm losing that bone density because my osteoblasts are slowing down. I'm not building as much bone. So 3 hormones, as you're studying for the upcoming exam, 3 hormones for us to know. Estrogen, which is the one we just talked about here, and we have this graph to help us interpret it. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. With each of these hormones, make sure we know which kinds of cells they impact. So is it osteoclasts or osteoblasts? And make sure we know if it makes them more active or less active. So make sure we know those things with these 3 hormones. On the very last page of your packet, by the way, bounce there. Very last page, oh, it messed it up. Okay, I ask you to relate the skeletal system to various other systems in the body. when you're thinking about the effects of the endocrine system on the skeletal system, that's what we've just talked about, right? So remind me again, what does the endocrine system do? What's the function of the endocrine system? Big picture. Yep, endocrine system is all about hormones, hormone system. So when I ask you to explain how the endocrine system impacts the skeletal system, here's that list that we just talked about. Estrogen, parathyroid hormone, calcitonin. So in your notes, as you're filling in this last activity where you're relating the endocrine system to the skeletal system, here's the 3 things we want to make sure we can explain how they impact the skeletal system. So what cells they impact, what they do to bone density, all that good stuff. Hey, this correlation here with the muscular system, how the muscular system affects the skeletal system, that comes back to this idea here. So fun correlation that I wanted you guys to make with the skeletal system chapter is the impact of gravity on bone density. Who can tell me from the lesson, how does gravity impact bone density? What's the effect of gravity on bone density? Okay, so are we talking, yeah, so I think all of you guys are telling me about space, right? You're telling me what happens in space? Because when I talk about gravity itself, when we live in an environment that has gravity, that constant pulling of gravity that pulls me to the earth, that actually, so I should have phrased it this way, the normal impact of gravity on bone density, normally it's going to increase bone density. Yeah, that's on me. That was a bad question. Yeah, yeah, it's the lack of gravity that leads to a decrease, right? So lack of gravity, we decrease bone density, decrease bone density. Absolutely. So normal job of just living on Earth, having gravity, that actually plays a big role in how strong your bones are. Like it helps to go out and exercise, right? And it helps to make sure you got calcium in your diet. But just the fact that you live on Earth helps to maintain your bone density. And we learned this the hard way because when we first started sending astronauts to space, for some reason we didn't consider that. And they came back from space and their bones had lost a ton of density. I can't remember if I put it in the guided lesson or not. Did I give you guys a number for how much it ages their skeleton to go to space? I always quote the number wrong. I can't remember if I had put that in the guided lesson or not. Yeah, so they lose about 1% of their bone density every month. It ends up being when they come back from space, their skeleton has aged the equivalent on Earth of like years. So just by not having gravity for however long they're gone, they lose a ton of bone density, losing it at 1% every month, and that has a big impact on them. So one of the ways that we poorly try to combat that, but we're doing something at least, is we have astronauts actually engage in resistance exercise. So resistance exercise. The goal of resistance exercise is to get your muscles to pull really hard on your bones. Because another way for us to increase bone density here on Earth or in space is to pull on those bones. So using your muscles to pull on the bones, that's a way that we can try to increase or at least maintain bone density. So astronauts will exercise when they're in space to make sure that they don't lose all of their bone density. I mean, some bone loss is just a given because they're not constantly being pulled on by gravity. But if we can do something like resistance exercise, we can save some of that bone that we lost. So when there's that question on the last page that asks you about the way that the muscular system impacts the skeletal system, it has a lot to do with things like exercising. If I pull on my bones, that helps them to remodel and stay strong. If I stop pulling on them because we're in space and there's no gravity and I'm not exercising, I'm going to lose a lot of my bone density. For those of us that have started to work on our skeletal system disorders activity, there's a question that relates to the disorder of rickets that helps us to understand how the integumentary system, I think it got lost on here. Yep. You have a question about how the integumentary system impacts the skeletal system. Remind me, the integumentary system, what's the easy person name for this? What's the easy name for the integumentary system? Yeah, this is the skin. Okay, so the skin here. The skin makes something that the skeletal system needs to be able to get the calcium that you need in your bones. Does anyone know the name of what your skin makes to help you absorb calcium? Yeah, Gloria's right. Vitamin D. Vitamin D. Sometimes vitamin D is called the sunshine vitamin. Sunshine vitamin. We talked a little bit about this last chapter with lesson number 7. How you go outside for about 15 minutes with your arms uncovered, and that's enough sun exposure to get the vitamin D that you need for the day. Vitamin D is something that we need in our body to be able to absorb dietary calcium. So when we're talking about our relationship between the digestive system and the skeletal system, I absorb calcium from my diet to go into my bloodstream, to go into my bones. But I can't absorb calcium from my diet unless I have enough vitamin D. So my sunshine vitamin, vitamin D, that I make using my skin, exposure to UV actually, if I don't have enough vitamin D, I'm going to have a calcium deficiency because I need vitamin D to be able to absorb my calcium. So that's actually the problem with rickets. With rickets, typically you see it in environments where there's not, so northern latitudes is what the video talks about. People that live farther from where the UV rays of the sun hit the earth, they have a harder time making the vitamin D that they need. Without that vitamin D, you can't absorb your calcium. And that's an issue with calcium levels in the bone. So when we talk about how the skin relates to the bones, it's all about vitamin D. When we talk about the digestive system and how that relates to the bones, it's all about getting that calcium that you need. There was one more system. I don't know if you guys can remind me in the chat because it ate it for me. I don't remember what the other system was. Nicole, the skin doesn't absorb vitamin D, it actually makes it. So when UV radiation hits a molecule that's inside your skin, it transforms it into active vitamin D. So we absorb the UV radiation to help us build vitamin D. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, well, I think there's only one more topic we haven't talked about, and that's braces. How many of us had braces or have them currently? Any braces, friends, in class today? Jacqueline says, oh, yeah. Yes, yep. 6 years, wow. Yeah, Jesse, both your daughters, yep. So the cool thing about braces is that they show us the process of bone remodeling. Bone remodeling. We haven't talked a lot about bone remodeling, but bone remodeling is just like if you were to do like a remodel in your house. So we take what's there, the bone tissue that's there, and we change it. We build it into a new shape. So bone remodeling is what we're doing when we do braces, when we do orthodontia is the technical name for it. So here's how this process works. We start with a tooth that's in the socket, and let's say that this tooth is too far apart from its neighbor tooth. So I need to pull it closer to its neighbor tooth. So what we do is we attach some metal to that tooth, and we use wires in between it and its neighbors to start pulling the tooth toward the middle. Now, as I pull the tooth this direction, I start putting pressure on this side of my tooth socket over here. The pressure that I put on this side of the tooth socket tells my osteoclasts that we don't need all of the bone tissue that's over here. Remind me, what do osteoclasts do? What's the job of an osteoclast? Yeah, these are my breakers, right? My bone breakers. So I put pressure on the bone right here. Osteoclasts say, oh, you don't want this bone here. Let me resorb it. Let me break it down. So we go from having this much bone to having this much bone. We've broken some of it down. And as we break down the bone here, as the tooth starts shifting toward the middle, my osteoblasts say, oh, we need some more bone inside here because this tooth has moved toward the opposite direction. So my osteoblasts come in and add bone tissue behind where that tooth used to be. So when we look at our final picture we get here, you can see in the dotted lines where we started, where kind of the socket for this tooth was, and where we ended up. My tooth shifted over. So it used to start right here, and now it starts over a little bit farther. We've moved it toward the middle, where I've resorbed some of the bone. And it used to be over more toward the left, where I've added new bone tissue to push it toward the middle. So when someone has braces, when they're doing orthodontia, what we're actually doing is pushing on our bone tissue to tell the bone breakers to get rid of it, and the bone builders to build some new bone to hold those teeth in place. This is why, by the way, I always get the student question about retainers. The reason that we have to do retainers is we got to make sure that our osteoblasts build that bone and they're good for us. Because if we just break down the bone and we don't build that bone and they're good, these teeth might want to naturally slide backwards. So retainers help us to keep that force in place when we're no longer applying it on the outside or on the top part of the tooth. So orthodontia, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts in action. That's all I've got. What questions do you guys have? Yeah, go for it, Jessie.
Okay, so does it work the same when you expand the jaw? Because my daughter had to have an expander put on the top to actually widen her jaw a little bit. Does it do the same thing, so to speak? Break down the bone and build it back up?
Yeah, so I'm not totally familiar with expanders, but yeah, I believe it would be the same process, because if we're going to have any new bone tissue, it's always going to have to come from those osteoblasts.
Okay.
If we build new bone tissue, we've got to get rid of the bone tissue that's not helpful anymore. So yeah, I would think it's the same kind of deal.
Right.
How long did she have to have that in?
I think she wore the expander for 6 months.
Yeah.
About 6 months, I want to say. I can't remember. She's a senior this year, and we got them put on her 8th grade. I think she was in 8th grade. We're about done. We're almost done.
I'm sure that's exciting.
The oldest too, she had them on for 5 years too. She had another issue. Her eye teeth would not come down. So they did a surgery and tried to attach brackets to them and pull them down. However, one of them kept refusing itself back to the bone, so they just pulled it out. Yeah. And the other one, after a year and a half, I mean, it moved a little, but not enough.
Yeah.
So now she just needs to get false permanent ones put in there because they
Uh-huh.
pulled those two. It sucked, but it doesn't usually happen. Usually they move down. So the chances of that were very little.
Mhm.
However, if it happens to anyone, it's going to happen to her.
Right.
Just one of those.
Yeah, I'm
So,
sorry.
no, they're gorgeous now, so it's
Yeah.
okay.
I found an article that was talking about seeing how humans are still evolving. More and more people are starting to be born without wisdom teeth. They go through their entire life and they never get wisdom teeth because nobody has space in their jaw for them.
Right.
So we're starting to see with human evolution that more and more people are starting to never have wisdom teeth.
I
Also,
actually
more and more
was
people are starting to have this new artery in their arm as well. So that's kind of fun too. I'll have to see if I can find that article to put in our current events library because that's a fun one.
I was actually praying that she would have wisdom teeth so that when they came in, they would push the other teeth forward and then she wouldn't have to get permanent ones put in. But I think she did have the two wisdom teeth come in, but that it wasn't enough.
Wasn't enough.
Yeah.
To get them up there.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't think my youngest has any wisdom teeth yet, and she's 17. She'll be 18 this month, actually. So,
Yeah.
so I don't know.
Well,
I was interested. That's interesting that you brought it up.
yeah, that is interesting. I see a question in the chat. Yes, Jacqueline, Monday we're going to review. I have a list. Let me pull up my list from yesterday. We wanted to talk about the feedback loops. We wanted to do some translation together. Were there any other topics in particular that you guys can think of now that you want me to add to my list? I'll make sure I have those pictures. Anything's game next Monday at 9:30, but the more prepared I can be, the better. To your question, Keenan, the virtual session from yesterday is when you're in our Blackboard site, it says virtual office hours. There's a folder in there that says resources from virtual office hours. So the recording is posted in unit number 2. Yesterday's recording is there for you. Yeah, great question, Gloria. If we would lose our erector pili, it certainly doesn't do much for humans. So maybe we will. We'll see. I'm back in, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of years we'd need to see that. But yeah, I really need to find that article about the wisdom teeth and the blood vessels. All right, well, if there are no other particular questions, I will stop the recording today. I'll stick around for any last minute questions that you guys have. Otherwise, good luck on lesson number 8. Make sure to get it done Friday. And then the skeletal systems disorders and the group wiki and the current events in anatomy, all of that stuff on Sunday. So make sure we catch it all.